There is a fire hall in Frenchville, Pennsylvania, with a scale in it. Every February for 35 years, men have hung dead coyotes on that scale in front of a crowd, with money riding on the number. Once a year, the legend in these mountains has to stand on something certified. Out of thousands of animals weighed across those decades, only about 10 have ever broken 50 pounds. This year's winner was 51 pounds even. Now stand at a gas pump in Elkins or Sneedville and listen to somebody describe the thing that crossed the road in front of their truck. 70 pounds. 80, chest like a shepherd, stood there and looked at me. So the scale says the stories are wrong, except that when researchers finally pulled DNA out of these animals, they didn't find a plain coyote and a bunch of exaggerating locals. They found two separate invasions that collided underneath Appalachia, a genetic seam running through Pennsylvania nobody knew was there until this year, and the fingerprints of an American wolf declared gone from the wild in 1980, still breeding inside animals everybody writes off as ordinary. The people who say that's not a coyote are wrong about the number. They're much closer than they know about the animal. Start with the animal that is supposed to be here. Open any field guide and the coyote you meet is a western creature, 20 to 35 pounds, knee-high. Light bones, narrow chest, the kind of thing that yips at the edge of a campground and evaporates the instant a light hits it. Out in the sage and the shortgrass, that animal is nearly all of them. Now look at what Pennsylvania's own game commission publishes. Adult males 45 to 55 pounds, females 35 to 40, and a flat statement that the eastern coyote is the largest wild canine in the state. Western average, low 20s. Eastern average, high 30s into the 40s with a hard ceiling near 50 for a genuinely big male. That is a 50 to 70% jump in body mass inside a single species over a few decades across a continent, which is why this argument never gets settled in one conversation at a feed store. Both halves are true at once. The 80-pound Appalachian monster does not exist, and the animal that does exist is so far outside the book that the book is useless. So the question isn't whether it's bigger, that's been settled for years. The question is where the extra 20 pounds came from, and the answer isn't in these mountains. It's in a place these animals passed through on the way here about a century ago when nobody was watching. Everyone knows the first half of this story, or thinks they do. We killed the wolves. The coyote moved in. True. Also about a third of what happened. Wolves did not merely occupy the eastern woods, they policed them. A healthy wolf population holds territory hard, keeping coyotes both suppressed and, critically, apart from wolves as mates. Remove the wolves, and you do not just open a door. You remove the thing preventing two species from ever meeting on equal terms. What happened next was traced by Roland Kays, then at the New York State Museum, in a study that should be far more famous than it is. His team pulled mitochondrial DNA from 686 eastern coyotes and measured 196 skulls. What came out of that pile of bone and tissue was not one migration, it was two. The southern front came the way you would expect, straight east through the Midwest, into Ohio, across the river and up into the southern hills. Plain coyotes, prairie animals filling empty country. The northern front took the long way around, up over the Great Lakes into Ontario, where the first animals we would now recognize as eastern coyotes turn up around 1919, then across the St. Lawrence into New York and New England. And in that northern corridor, in the thin wolf country of southern Canada, they met wolves that could not find enough of their own kind to breed with, so they bred with each other. Here's the part that gives the whole thing its shape. Those two fronts did not perform equally. The northern hybrid front had larger skulls. It had more difference between males and females, the sexual dimorphism you see in wolves, not the near identical pairs you see out west. And it colonized new ground roughly 5 times faster than the southern front did. 5 times. Same species, same continent, same century. The difference was the wolf in the mix. There is one more detail in that data, and it changes how you look at the animal in your field. Genetic diversity in the Northeast is strikingly low, which points to something almost absurd. The entire northeastern population appears to have been founded by a very small number of females making the crossing over the St. Lawrence. A handful of animals swimming a river. That is the seed of every big coyote from Maine to Georgia. And the two fronts, the wolf-loaded northern wave and the plain southern wave, eventually ran into each other. Not in some remote wilderness. They collided in western New York and Pennsylvania. Which means there is a line. An actual genetic boundary laid down inside a single human lifetime running through the top of Appalachia. Every animal that has ever gone onto that scale in Frenchville came out of one of those two waves. The scale can't tell you which one. For a long time, nobody could find that line either, because coyotes travel so far and breed so freely that everyone assumed it would have smeared into nothing decades ago. This year, researchers found it anyway. In March 2026, a team led by Craig Marshall out of Bridget von Holt's lab at Princeton published a study with a title that sounds like a novel and reads like a warning. Signatures of the Anthropocene: Population Genomic Structure Detected in Pennsylvania Coyotes. The scale of it is what matters. Genome-wide data from 1,199 coyotes across the northeastern United States, including 901 Pennsylvania animals sampled across a full decade, 2014 to 2024, donated by hunters, state wildlife programs, and the USDA. Worth pausing on. One of the largest genomic pictures ever assembled of this animal, and the raw material came out of the beds of pickup trucks. The expectation going in was that they'd find nothing. Coyotes disperse enormous distances. A young male will walk 100 miles looking for territory. Species like that are supposed to be genetic soup. They found structure anyway, 2 distinct genetic clusters with a weak transition zone bleeding between them, and Pennsylvania sitting right on top of it as a recent contact zone. The northern wave and the southern wave, still distinguishable, still meeting 100 years later, and the pattern lined up with human density and human activity, not with mountain ranges, not with rivers, with us. That's why the word Anthropocene is in the title. Now here is where I have to hand you the piece that doesn't fit the headline, because if I skip it, somebody in the comments will catch it and they'll be right to. That same study measured the animals. And on the temporal question, are Pennsylvania coyotes physically getting bigger year over year right now? The answer was no robust shift, no clean upward line. The only thing they found was a weak trend toward increased body mass in males in the southwest of the state. So say it plainly, the best data we have does not show these animals swelling in real time. What it shows is that they arrived big. They got their size on the way here, in Ontario, from wolves, before most of the people telling these stories were born. And they've stayed that way ever since, which is exactly what you'd expect from a trait that's working. The tense in the story is wrong. The story itself is not. And that same study contains a second detail that explains something people in these hills feel constantly without being able to name. Heavy, sustained hunting pressure creates a landscape of ecological vacancies, territory that empties and refills from outside. That churn can inflate the apparent population, break social cohesion when dominant animals are removed, and trigger compensatory reproduction. Bigger litters, more animals pushed out looking for a place to be. Which means the coyote in your pasture this spring is very likely not the coyote from last spring. It's a different animal from somewhere else, filling a hole. You aren't watching one animal get bigger. You're watching a conveyor belt, and you're noticing the big end of it. If you've seen one of these, the one that was too big, or that didn't run, or that had a coat you couldn't place, drop your county in the comments. Not the state, the county. There are patterns in this the maps genuinely haven't caught yet, and this comment section has turned up things I haven't found in any paper. Everything I've described so far runs back to one wolf, and it's a northern one. Great Lake stock picked up in Ontario on the crossing. That explains the size, and for years it was considered the whole story. Then researchers went looking in the south. And what they found down there is the reason this video exists. The eastern United States had its own wolf. Not the gray wolf of the northern forests, a different animal entirely. The red wolf. Rangier, longer in the leg, and finer in the muzzle than a gray wolf, and only modestly larger than a big coyote. It gets called America's wolf for a specific reason. It's the only wolf species whose entire range sat inside the borders of the United States, never spilling into Canada or Mexico. And its range was no pocket. The red wolf once ran from Texas to the Atlantic and up into the Ohio River Valley, the top canine predator across an enormous sweep of the eastern country, including these mountains, for thousands of years. By the middle of the 20th century, it was collapsing. Habitat loss, bounties, relentless persecution. Then the coyotes arrived from the west, into a population too thin to find its own kind. And the last red wolves did what canids always do when their world runs out. They bred with whatever was there. By 1980, biologists made the hardest call in American conservation. They trapped the last wild red wolves out of southwestern Louisiana and southeastern Texas and started over in captivity. Out of everything they caught, only 14 animals became the founders of the entire species. 14. Every red wolf alive today traces back to those 14 animals. And then, the part almost nobody in Appalachia knows happened. They tried to bring it home. In November of 1991 in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, a gate opened on a holding pen and a family of red wolves walked out into Tennessee. The Fish and Wildlife Service had approached the park directly. The Smokies plus the surrounding national forests offered one of the largest blocks of federal land in the east. The following year, 2 more families were released. One of them at Cades Cove, which today takes more than 2 million visitors a year and is probably the single most photographed valley in the southern Appalachians. For 7 years, there were wild red wolves in the Smoky Mountains. 37 animals were released across the life of the project. Around 40 pups were born in the wild inside the park. Not one of them survived to adulthood. Disease, starvation, prey that wasn't where it needed to be at the elevation they were released into. The wolves that lived did what hungry animals do, walked downhill, out of the park boundary, onto private land, into pastures with newborn calves. The farmers who were nervous about the project turned out to have been nervous about the right thing. And there was one more problem, quieter than the rest, that nobody could do anything about. The coyotes had gotten there first. The southern front had already filled these mountains. And where a red wolf couldn't find a red wolf, there was evidence it settled for a coyote instead. On October 8, 1998, the Fish and Wildlife Service published a formal notice of termination in the Federal Register. The stated reasons were clinical, extremely low pup survival, and the inability of the released wolves to establish home ranges within the park. Of the 37 animals released, 26 had already died or been recaptured after wandering onto private land. The collared survivors were tracked down, caught, and removed. Officially, that's the end of it. No red wolves in Tennessee. Program closed. A failed experiment filed away. But hold on to the shape of what actually happened there. They recaptured the animals they could find, the ones wearing collars. They could not recapture what had already gone into the population. Here is where the internet version of this story goes off a cliff, and I'm not taking you over it. The careful version is better anyway. Decades after the last red wolves were pulled off the Gulf Coast, researchers went back to that exact landscape and tested the ordinary, nobody-looks-twice coyotes living there. The genomes came back carrying red wolf ancestry. Not a whisper, not a rounding error. In coyotes along coastal southwestern Louisiana, the analysis put it at 38 to 62% of the genome, an admixture profile strikingly similar to the canids captured there before the red wolf vanished. The technical term is a ghost allele, genetic variation from a population that is functionally gone, surviving by hiding inside a more successful relative. Then came Galveston Island off the Texas coast, and the origin of that discovery is so improbable it sounds invented. A field biologist named Ron Wooten kept photographing island canids that didn't look right to him. Agency after agency turned him down before he emailed Bridget von Holtz at Princeton, and it was the photographs that made her look twice. He sent tissue from 2 roadkill animals. One sample was lost in transit, so he mailed in the scalpel he'd used, and the lab pulled DNA off the blade. That's how one of the biggest canid discoveries in decades entered the record, a dirty scalpel in the mail. Follow-up work scaled it up properly, hundreds of fecal samples, and identified 24 Galveston coyotes and 8 more on the Texas mainland carrying over 10% red wolf ancestry, 2 of them above 50. And underneath that sits the finding that actually matters. The population carried 5 private alleles found in none of the North American reference groups. Not in southeastern coyotes, not in gray wolves, not even in the captive red wolves. Red wolf genetic variation that exists nowhere else on Earth, riding around in animals we call vermin. And the detail that ties it straight back to the shape in your pasture? When researchers weighed and measured those Gulf Coast animals, ancestry tracked with size. More wolf in the genome, more animal on the scale. That correlation isn't a statistical accident either. You can point at the locus. Work published in Current Biology identified a single non-coding variant near the IGF-1 gene, insulin-like growth factor 1, as very likely the main body size mutation across the entire dog family. One position in the genome acting as a dial between small canid and large canid, the same switch that separates a Chihuahua from a Mastiff. And the geography of that dial maps almost comically cleanly. West Coast coyotes are essentially locked into the small version. That allele runs around 0.93 frequency, near fixed, with a mean body mass around 9 kilograms, roughly 20 pounds, the field guide animal. East Coast coyotes carry all three genotypes, and their mean body mass is around 16 kilograms, roughly 35 pounds. When researchers zoomed in on Pennsylvania animals specifically, the relationship between which version a coyote carried and what it weighed was statistically significant. So this isn't a feeling about how the light hits something at the tree line. There's a physical piece of DNA, common in eastern coyotes and largely absent from western ones, that scales the body up. It came east through hybridization. It is still moving. Now the discipline. That ghost is a southern ghost, and it's concentrated. The heaviest and oldest red wolf signal sits in southwestern Louisiana and southeastern Texas, right where the last wild wolves were caught, thinning outward along a west to east gradient. Move up into the Appalachians and the picture changes. When researchers analyzed coyote DNA in northern Virginia, they found interbreeding with Great Lakes wolves, the northern signal, arriving down the spine of the mountains, and specifically did not find red wolf ancestry. Northern Virginia turned out to be a convergence point where both waves meet. So the honest answer for a ridge in West Virginia or eastern Kentucky is this: that heft is far more likely an inheritance from a northern wolf picked up in Ontario a century ago than from the red wolf that used to own this exact ground. The ghost is real, it's mostly southern, and that leaves the question everybody actually came here with. Before the numbers, one limit has to be said out loud, because it cuts in both directions. You cannot see a genome. Researchers have repeatedly found animals loaded with wolf ancestry that looked, to the eye, like completely ordinary coyotes. Size, color, how it carries itself, how long it holds your stare, none of it reliably tells you what's inside. On Galveston, the only reason anyone knew was 2 dead animals and a scalpel. So I know what I saw is not evidence. And neither, biologists spent 30 years learning this the hard way, is that's just a coyote. Which is exactly why the fear question needs numbers instead of impressions. Researchers compiling attack records across the entire United States and Canada documented 367 coyote attacks on humans across nearly 4 decades. 2 countries, a continent where there's hardly a county east of the Mississippi without them. Confirmed fatalities in that entire record? 2. A 3-year-old girl in Glendale, California in 1981. A 19-year-old woman in Nova Scotia in 2009. That's the ceiling. Against it, the animal at your fence line barely registers next to the drive you took to get home tonight. The real risk is specific, and it's manufactured by us. When researchers classified attack motivations, the largest categories were predatory and investigative. Not the behaviors of an animal that fears people, but of one that has learned people are a food source. Direct feeding, or the lazier version, unsecured trash, pet food on a porch, a carcass dumped at the tree line. And the friction that actually plays out across Appalachia isn't about people at all. The eastern animal, bigger jaw, longer leg, and a wolf-inherited willingness to hold territory and hunt as a family group is a genuinely more capable predator of livestock, outdoor cats, small dogs, and deer. A lone western coyote rarely takes an adult deer. These do. That's a real cost, and nobody's dismissing it. But it's a livestock problem wearing a monster costume. The thing that turns a shy animal bold isn't wolf DNA. It's a bag of dog food on the steps. The danger was never inherited. We keep teaching it. Which brings this to the turn that stands the whole thing on its head. Every red wolf alive descends from those 14 founders. Fewer than 40 live in the wild in eastern North Carolina, a couple hundred more in managed care. And a species rebuilt from 14 animals has a slow motion problem no amount of good intentions fixes. There isn't enough variation left in the pool. Inbreeding is now the thing most likely to finish what the bounty hunters started. And the missing variation turns out not to have gone missing at all. It's in the coyotes. Those Gulf Coast animals, carrying alleles that exist in no reference population on Earth, including the captive wolves themselves, represent red wolf genetic material conservation had written off as permanently lost. Not a curiosity, a reservoir. The largest untapped source of red wolf diversity anywhere, sitting inside the species we blamed for the extinction. Researchers now study these hybrids not as contamination to be scrubbed off the landscape, but as material to be protected. In 2026, von Holt was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship for conservation genomics work built on exactly this. On ghost wolves nobody wanted, from an island where a man was mailing scalpels to Princeton because no agency would return his calls. Which puts a strange, quiet light back on those 7 years in the Smokies. That project is filed as a failure, and by its own metrics it was one. But look at why it failed. It failed because coyotes had already taken the ground, and where a wolf couldn't find a wolf, it bred with what was there. That's the exact mechanism, same behavior, same desperation that preserved red wolf ancestry on the Gulf Coast for 40 years after everyone agreed the animal was finished. The thing that broke the recovery in Cades Cove is the thing that kept the species salvageable 800 miles southwest. So go back to that scale in the fire hall in Frenchville, 51 pounds, not 70. The number the mountain says out loud has always been wrong, and the men writing it down every February for 35 years were the ones telling the truth about it. But the number was never the story. The animal on that scale is a prairie coyote that crossed a river in Canada with a wolf in its blood, walked 2,000 miles into ground where a different wolf used to stand, and is now, in some corners of this country, the last physical place that other wolf still exists. It isn't a monster, it isn't a new species, it isn't stalking your porch, it's a coyote carrying a ghost. And depending on which direction that ghost came from, it might be the only reason we get the wolf back at all. The pasture goes quiet, the shape steps back into the tree line, and nothing about it has changed except what you now know is inside it. Subscribe if you want the rest of what these mountains have quietly folded away. There's a great deal of it, and almost none of it looks like what people expect.